we're going to talk about forgiven of debts. In Matthew 6:12, Yeshua said, he's teaching us to pray. He says, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And the companion verse in Luke, and forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who is indebted to us, and lead us not into temptation. Now, for those of us who study the whole Bible, there's a theme here that Yeshua is talking about that we don't often think about when, forgive me, John, most of Christianity, mainstream Christianity, right? Uh, they just think that this is about being a kind and forgiving person, a very superficial application, which is absolutely what this means. I mean, on the plane, the Peshat, that's what it means, is that you are supposed to be a very forgiving and kind and generous person. We need to follow the pattern of Yeshua because he forgave even his executioners. And it's a pretty big, pretty tall order. And the general sentiment that we need to forgive debts is a sound and easy to comprehend. We need to be forgiving on all fronts. But Yeshua is actually referencing the Torah here. He's referencing the Torah in kind of a slight way that we're going to delve into, because when he says, forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors, that's a mitzvot. That's a commandment. That is not a commandment to actually have a periodic forgiveness of debts and the establishment of Yahweh's economy. So here, Leviticus 25, 1-4, Yahweh spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to Yahweh. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to Yahweh, and you shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. So the beginning of this culture, where is the beginning of Yahweh's culture? It was in the second song we sang today. It's in the Sabbath, in this pattern of sevens. The Sabbath is the first 7, and then the next 7 is the sabbatical years, and then you have 49 plus 1 for the Jubilee. And then during the Sabbath, the Yahweh, establishes a culture on the 7th day of creation, where each week we rest from our works, emulating how God rested from his work on the 7th day of creation. So, Shabbat Shalom. Yeah, all right. We rest. We rest our servants, our livestock, everything that can rest gets a rest on the 7th day of the week. The same concept extends to the 7th year. The 7th year is broadened to the sabbatical, and this would have been the 7th year from entering the land. They were supposed to establish this pattern to keep every 7 years to have a rest for the ground, a rest from toil, a rest from agriculture, which would do what? Which would extend throughout the economy. Throughout the economy, people who sharpen plows, people who raise livestock for work, everybody would have a break, right? Some people wouldn't have a break. Your real estate agents wouldn't have a break, right? But most of the land, because it was agricultural, would have a big break, which carries throughout. And the people would be vulnerable. Did you ever think of it from that perspective? Because if you don't plant, the next year you don't have food, so you are relying on the Creator to provide for you, and you wouldn't be able to deploy an army. Because this idea that we're in perpetual wars forever and ever and ever isn't supposed to be a thing. You're not supposed to be in perpetual war. You're supposed to be in perpetual peace. You're not supposed to have to worry about your borders. You're not supposed to have to worry about invasion. You're not supposed to have to store up food for people to constantly plan for battle and have supply chains that extend to other places. This vulnerability is key because salvation has always been by faith. We're often told that when we follow the Torah that we're trying to do a works-based salvation, when if you read the Torah, it was never a works-based salvation. When When it says that while we were yet sinners, Messiah died for us. Well, that also extends to when Israel didn't even know Yahweh. He brought in Moses to guide them out of the land. He brought in the plagues. They were in the land for 39 years without an economy. 40 years. Without an economy. How are you going to eat? You're going to be fed miraculously. You're going to be fed supernaturally. You're going to have manna fall from heaven. And then the ingrates went and complained about that. So then they got quail, right? He still loves his children and wants to give them what they want. But they had to have that faith. The sabbatical year comes into play because you have to have faith that Yahweh's going to feed you every 7 years. He's going to protect you. And that extends to the festivals every year. Because what happens in the springtime? You bring in the harvest. You fill up the storehouses, and then you go away from your storehouses. All the men present themselves before Yahweh in wherever the tent of meeting was, or in Jerusalem, right? Which means that the borders are wide open and there's food at the borders. They've harvested their food and they've brought the first fruits to Jerusalem, which means the people in the north, the people in the south, the people in the east are completely, all the men are gone, and all the invading army doesn't even have to bring food. They could just bring their weapons and eat the food that's prepared. So this culture that Yahweh established assumed that he would protect those people for the rest of eternity had they remained faithful, just like he did in the wilderness. And what further proof would you need than the fact that a nation was raised up in Egypt and then fed for 39 years in the desert? So the only place I can find in history where Israel kept a Sabbath year is in the book of Maccabees. It's the only reference that I could find. And I went on a hunt. So if somebody else has more stuff, please send it my way. But in 1 Maccabees 6, it's not scripture. It's we call it apocrypha. It's good stuff to read, but we don't, treat it as scripture. But 1 Maccabees 6, 49 to 54 is the official account of the revolt of Maccabees, is the official account of the revolt of the Jews against the Greeks. It is the first time the abomination of desolation was set up. When Yeshua talked about that in Matthew 24, he was referring to something that had already happened once. I was kind of shocked that I didn't know that until I knew that. And I was like, why didn't I know that before, right? But in Maccabees, they were vulnerable because they were attacked in the 7th year, and they were observing the 7th year. Why is that not in the Bible? Right? One of my mentors, a rabbi named Bob, I said, hey, can you put together 50 years where Israel actually did what they were supposed to do? He's like, no, you can't do that. It doesn't exist. So they never made it to keeping one Jubilee. That's curious. And we don't see the sabbatical year in the Tanakh at all. We don't see them observing it. It's only outside. Ultimately, the Maccabees prevailed. They liberated Judea. They pushed the Greeks out, and that paved the way for Messiah to come. One just anecdotal thing is the restraint that they had. When you see what Saul was the first king, his restraint was gone, and he decided he could do whatever he wanted to do, right? In this case, with Judas Maccabeus and his boys, pushed out the Greeks had defiled the altar, and they said, what do we do with these bricks? And they said, and this is their decision, we're going to rebuild the altar, we're going to take the defiled bricks, and we're going to stack them up until a prophet of God comes to tell us what to do with them. They realized that there was something, a task that they had to do that exceeded their authority. And they had to wait for a word from the Lord to tell them what to do. So I encourage people to read 1 Maccabees and see what faith looks like. because they went against all odds. And then the Greeks had killed any woman who was circumcising her children. They did horrible, horrible things. And once the Jews liberated Judea, they went around circumcised every little boy, and they reinstated the Torah. That's a key part of history, because without that, we don't get to the Second Temple period of Yeshua and the Roman occupation. But the seventh year was a time to prove faithfulness by not working the land. When we think about the Day of Atonement, how do we express our faith? By doing nothing, by relying on Yahweh, by rejecting food, by rejecting water. And we can't fully reject him, can we? Because we cannot stop breathing. He owns the air. He owns it all. And on the Day of Atonement, we are to do nothing while Yeshua is the mediator between man and God. In the Old Testament, the people had to do nothing while the high priest went into minister for the nation. They had to trust that the high priest was going and doing his job. They couldn't see it. They couldn't go in there. They couldn't verify. They had to have the faith that that mediator was actually going to actually perfectly do what he had to do to atone for the sins of the people. Blessed are they who believe without seeing. Today we come together on the Sabbath during Sukkot to honor our Messiah, to honor his Father. But we don't see our evidence as words on a book. We believe these things happened without seeing any of them. We believe that the word was handed down accurately. We believe that the Messiah died and was resurrected 3 days and 3 nights later. We believe that the apostles continued to keep the holy days and the Torah because of what they wrote, and also extra biblical sources, because there's a lot of Roman Christianity that was trying to stop people from doing these things. And they wrote letters and made decrees that said, stop doing these things. So we know that our people, our ancestors, were accurately doing it. So, the bad news. Jeremiah 25:11, the whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 2 Chronicles 36:20-21. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths all the days of its desolation. It kept Sabbaths until 70 years were completed. So the Babylonian captivity and desolation was 70 years to make up for the time Israel skipped the sabbatical year. Yahweh is not going to be ripped off. Okay? He's not going to do that. He wants that land to have a rest. He knows what he created. He knows what that land is supposed to do. He knows what it's supposed to produce and when it's supposed to have a rest. He knows that those animals need to have a rest. And so he got paid back. He kicked them out for 70 years. It's interesting. It's 490 years, is 7 times 70. And the Maccabean revolt against Greece and the restoration of Judea as Torah observant happened after the return from exile. So it makes a ton of sense that they would have kept the sabbatical year, because they would have learned their lesson. Isn't that a problem in the Bible, where we have periods of restoration and then the people fall away, and then restoration and fall away? Here we have a period of restoration and continued faithfulness. They kept that sabbatical year because they didn't want to go back to Babylon. They didn't want to offend their father and our father. Nehemiah and Ezra were quite clear about learning the lessons of Israel's apostasy. When they read the Torah, and the people who could understand Hebrew Understand the Torah was not written in any other language at that moment in time, right? It was when the people who came back from Babylon that spoke Aramaic couldn't understand the Torah and had to have people intervene for them. This is kind of the birth of the rabbinical system, because from this point on, they learned their lesson. And from this point on, instead of the Torah being read every 7 years, which we should do and will do, the Torah is read every year. The Torah portions come from this time period. The synagogue system comes from this time period. What language is synagogue? That's not Hebrew, by the way. It's a Greek word. Synagogues are set up all over the world, and the Torah portions are established so that people don't go back. So they're refreshed. Very good things that come out of this. When the Messiah comes, he honors these things. His ministry effectively starts in Luke 4 in a synagogue reading the Torah portion for the book of Isaiah. So part of Torah observing today is realizing how wrong our society is. We're here at fall, and the harvest is abound here in the Midwest. Are they scraping those fields clean? Are they leaving anything? Is there even anything for the deer to eat? Okay. They raise the land, R-A-Z-E, not R-A-I-S-E. They shave it. They get every tenth of a cent that they can get out of those crops, and don't leave anything behind. And when the land starts being exhausted, they inject ammonia. And when that doesn't work, they switch crops. And they do whatever they can to keep that land producing. Because this society we live in leans on our own understanding. We can build it. We can make it. What does it say in Revelation about one of those bad characters as she sits as a queen and not a widow? She's saying, you can't touch me. I've got my storehouses. I've got my navy. I've got my Babylonian empire. Nobody's going to take this from me. Well, that's what it looks like when you don't follow the Torah. You don't have faith. You lean on your own understanding. The world keeps the wrong holy days. The world should be keeping the Torah. This is why the Hebrews were called, chosen to be a light to the nations. When Solomon built that marvelous temple and everybody streamed in, it was so that they could learn the Torah and learn how to go home and be blessed like Solomon was blessed. Instead, we have apostasy. We're supposed to keep the right holy days. And it's true and it's great that we have been called to keep these things and adapt. We have frustrations that the rest of the world doesn't have. We keep the right holidays. We keep the culture that Yahweh put forth as much as we can, which puts us at odds with this world. The Torah isn't just a set of holy days and rules, though. It establishes an entire culture for a society. It establishes the culture that Yahweh intended for man to have. So, Leviticus 25, 8 through 10. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound a horn in all your land. Thus you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. So the weekly Sabbath to the 7-year sabbatical year, then we progress to the Jubilee. What does this mirror? Mirrors the count to Shavuot. We have 7 Sabbaths, or 7 weeks plus a day, Here we have then we have 7 years plus a day. Then we do that 7 times. So it seems like these numbers might mean something. We see the same pattern over and over and over, right? Our society is base 12 because we use the imperial system, except for John. Asterisk. He's a base 10 guy. He's a metric system guy, right? But the base 7 here seems to be pretty important. And the 50th year would have been a double sabbatical year, no planting or harvesting for 2 straight years. The land would get a complete reset. Now, social scientists and business majors have discovered something, that there is a cycle to business. There's a cycle to civilizations. They don't last. They will come and they will go, right? We have industry business barons learn when the Nokia phone is going to go and give way to the Apple phone. So the business people know that phone or that technology is gonna rise, it's gonna fall. So they want to know when to take their money that they invested in the Nokia company and move it to the Samsung or the Apple company. These business cycles are studied because they exist, because our society was built to have them. We see large cities in complete decay. The city of New York City, is still running on the same heating pipes that it was built with. Would you do that on purpose? Would you set up your house to have the same heating pipes for 100 years? That's unsustainable. When you have skyscrapers and city and built on top of this, they're going to fail, and they're going to fail abruptly. And they're going to have to change. And back in the East Coast, they have, it slays me because where I live, all of our power is under the ground. So we have ice storms and we have hail and we have all this stuff, and it doesn't matter because they put the cable under the ground in a tube. But back east, they're all on sticks. They lose their power every storm. And they're never digging up the ground to put that stuff in the ground. They're never going to do it. So we have cycles, and they come and we prop up these cities with enormous amounts of tax money and subsidies because the politicians need to get the votes from the people who live in the giant cities. So they won't tell them the bad news. They won't tell them the bad news that we didn't produce enough people for Social Security to maintain its solvency. And that's going away in 15 years. Let a politician tell you that and get elected. Not going to happen. They say, oh, we're not going to do anything about that. Well, can you add? There's not enough money on earth to pay for these things. So these cycles come and they go. And probably because Yahweh decided for it to be this way. Because he made this 50th year. He built in a reset into the culture of Israel so that you can get out of debt. We are not supposed to have home mortgages that go for 40 years. We are supposed to be an ownership society. In Britain, about 10 or 15 years ago, the price of homes got so big that they wanted to be able to bequeath the loan to their children. Do you understand? They wanted to bequeath debt, to make that debt keep going and keep going, so all these people in the cubicles with the fancy suits can continue to make their 0.25% as they move a little bit of money from one column of a spreadsheet to another. Perpetual debt. Now, they had a good motivation for doing it because the parents are never going to pay off the house. So if the parents pass away and the house has to get sold, then liquidated, then the kid has to get a brand new loan at the current value that is also never going to be paid off. You're a permanent servant. My daughter got her first credit card a couple years ago, and to establish credit out of the mouths of babes. She's like, what do I need that for? I have a debit card. I said, you run with that because you have to have the credit card so that way you can establish credit, so that way you can have a good rate on your car insurance. Did you know your car insurance takes your credit score into account? So does your homeowner's insurance. You can pay more to your neighbor for homeowner's insurance if they have a better credit score than you. So she has to build credit. Interest rate on this shiny Discover card, 21% interest. Go ahead and buy that iPhone, right? When's that getting paid off? That's loan sharking. Permanent debt is our society. But Yahweh says you're not going to have permanent debt. He knew that the propensity for people was to go into debt, so he provides a release so that generations have a chance at ownership, at prosperity. He wants us to be prosperous so that we can show up with something 3 times a year to give to him to say thanks. He doesn't want us to show up at the temple with an 840 credit score. He wants to show up with property, with tangible assets and things that have value. So he sets up a system of government where everybody lives by these rules. You can't have a credit card go forever because it has to be reset. All the debts have to be forgiven. And so I got ahead of myself. Deuteronomy 15, 1-3. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact of his neighbor and exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because Yahweh's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. So we look at that and say, look at that. Those mean Jews could oppress people. The other way to look at that is that's motivating the foreigner to become an Israelite. That's a motivation to want to be in the culture. Do you want to be a permanent debtor, or do you want to be grafted into the vine, adopted child of Abraham, to where you get to partake of this economy? We don't want to live in debt, and we don't want to scrunch debt out of other people and keep them under our thumb. That's no way to be. The release of debts is such a key part of the culture, and I wanted to speak about it today because our society would disintegrate if this ever happened. Bono from U2 went around 20 years ago. He went to these developing nations and realized that they keep getting loan money, right? Like we're loaning Ukraine money to fight the Russians, to buy our stuff. We loaned them the money to buy our stuff. Is that mafia or what? Right? But Bono wanted to go around and have all of the wealthy nations forgive all the debt of the African nations and the Far East nations. He wanted to have a Jubilee. That's never going to happen because everybody makes their living off this margin, off the percent. It's not even real money. They just say we've attributed 6% to this debt, and we move it from one column to the next, and they pay out all the commissions, and everybody gets a Porsche. But do you think the guy driving a Porsche bought it on a loan? No, he did not buy the Porsche on the loan because he knows not to be in debt. He knows to use his money to get the compound interest to work for him. But if we had a release of debts, could you imagine? We have to have it. We need it. Right? The credit card debt in this country is $1 trillion. The student loans, I don't know. I don't think you should borrow money to get a degree that can't pay it back. Okay, you should probably look at that because my daughters are going to school, and we sat down and I said, okay, what degree do you want to get? This is what it pays. This degree pays this, right? By the way, people, do not waste your money on a Bachelor of Science degree. You're never paying it off. $60,000 a year. With $100,000 debt, you get a $60,000 a year job to go run samples in a laboratory. It's not worth it. It doesn't do it, right? Doesn't make any. It's perpetual debt that they start out with before they even before they enjoy one made dollar of their education, they're stuck $100,000 in debt. How evil is this? So we have to have a release of debts. Now, is our society ever going to do it? No, of course not. Of course, because everybody has, because part of forgiveness, at the end of the Civil War, to have reconstruction, you had family killing family, and they had to let bygones be bygones. Today, we hold a grudge if somebody cuts us off in traffic for a week. We don't have forgiveness. Your society is, I'm going to get mine. Can't believe you did that. Look at how the politicians talk to each other with such vitriol, such absolute loathing and hatred, vengeance all over the place. We're so far away from the compassion of the Torah. Yesterday, I talked about the guy who was hurt, 38 years, paralyzed, and they're stepping over him to go jump in the pool. And then at the end of that chapter, he says, if you believed Moses, you'd believe me. Because if they believed Moses, they'd have picked the guy up 37 years ago and put him in the water. What do we have today? Violence everywhere, violence. You don't even have a good old-fashioned fist fight. In school, the boys always getting rough and tumble, and they go and punch each other in the nose, and then it's over. Oh no, the first guy who goes down gets jumped now by a pack of animals. We have a very violent culture. Of course, it's prophesied, and Paul wrote, and Genesis 6 is going to repeat, where the thoughts of men are evil continually, constant, perpetual violence. Not for us. That stuff has to break our hearts. Because when Yeshua says he comes back, is he going to find faith? Is he going to find anybody down here going, stop it. Love your neighbor. Forgive your neighbor. Forgive the debts. My own parents lived in debt almost their entire lives. They knew nothing other than that. Every time they'd get out, right back in, right? You paid off the car, 1 month without a payment, you're trading it back in. Why you do that? Why do that? I've done it myself, right? Because it's so normalized. Why do that? My dad's 90 right now. My mom passed at 86. If they ever got out of debt, they went right back in. Supposed to be a 7-year sentence. And then if you got so bad that you had to sell yourself into indentured servitude, you still only had that 7-year release for your debts. It's compassion. It's to allow people to rebuild. There's no way to rebuild if you just have to heap more and more debt on stuff. So let's look at this New Testament now. Peter comes up to Yeshua and says, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Yeshua said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, doesn't that number mean a little bit more than it did a minute ago? Did Yahweh forgive Israel after they did their 70 years, which was to make up for the 70 times 7 mistake? This is a reference to the sabbatical year and the Jubilee. See how much you get out of the Bible when you read the whole thing? He's quoting Torah to him. But most people say, what does this mean? What does this 70 times 7 mean? Well, it means that you're supposed to forgive. It's built into the society, Peter. The forgiveness, the release of debts is built into the society. You're supposed to forgive them the same way that Israel paid its penance for 70 years and got restored to the land. He didn't forsake them. And it was a national sin. The not observing the sabbatical year was a national sin, not like individual sins where you go sin against your brother. And Yeshua is telling him here, look, I forgave all of you. All of you sinned. and you got forgiven 70 times 70. So you do that too. Nehemiah and Ezra read the Torah, and the people repented to the extreme, to the absolute extreme. And they said, okay, any mixed marriages, you're out of here. Only one way. It was only one way. If the child came from the mother, they were considered to have the bloodline. If it came only from the father with a foreign wife, out you go. They weren't going to make the mistake of who? Who made that mistake? It was a guy named Solomon, who had the foreign wives and set up the Asherah pole. He said, no, you ain't doing that. They repented to the extreme. So did the Maccabees. And as we've had this theme here, is we have free will until we don't. At some point, this world is going to repent. And we're going to have 1,000 years to make up for the sins of the prior 6,000. But this is the level of forgiveness that Yahweh wants for mankind, and he communicated it to us through his Torah. He communicated to us how to be forgiving by building a society that nobody ever made it. Nobody ever made it to that first 50th year. Could you imagine if they had? Would you ever want to live anywhere else? Where you got yourself on the down and the outs for so long, and we have societal poverty in the state nation with fourth generation people raised on welfare now. That's impossible in that community. It's impossible because at some point, rip everything up and start all over. So now, when Yeshua says, forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors, it's got a little bit more meaning. We've come full circle. The 1,000 years are coming with Satan going to be locked up, and the land is going to have its rest. And this earth is going to have the culture that its creator wants it to have. He will not be denied. And now we want to motivate people to get into that culture. Because that's how we should be forgiving and how loving and whatever. Not to point out the faults of others, but to point out the goodness and how to get better, how to improve. These nations and cities and corporations, they make their way on debt. It's going to be a thing of the past. This is that verse in Revelation where it talks about the sailors are looking off from afar and how their ability to make wealth, they can't sail anymore. Remember a couple years ago, we had a ship get sideways in the Suez Canal and it wrecked the entire world's economy. For 2 weeks, Suez Canal was jammed up for 2 weeks and the entire world's economy fell apart. Same thing, Baltimore Harbor, right? The union workers were threatened to strike. They said, we'll shut this country down. What happens when Babylon actually falls? Most people are going to be terrified. It's a huge change. We're not going to be terrified. We know it's coming. It's going to be a good time. All these industries and all this stuff that heaped up, and I don't think it's on purpose. I think it's just man's inclination to make money, to build and whatever, right? It's not like I guess Satan does have a hand in all this, but a lot of this is just people were raised to make money this way, and people were raised to go into the financial services. They don't see any problem with it. And when it finally comes to a halt and mankind gets a rest and we get to then live in this culture that not even Israel was able to make it 1 year to 50. So we have a lot to learn, don't we? Right? Because there's nobody getting resurrected that ever made it to the 50 years, right? So that'll be the first time it's kept. It's 50 years after the return of the Messiah. It's going to be a pretty joyous occasion. Probably not going to be a lot of people in debt at that point either. So that's all I have for today. I thought maybe we can open it up for comments. Oh, look at that. Somebody was ready to go.
So technically, when Yeshua returns, that will be a year of Jubilee.
Yeah.
because all the captives will be released, debts will be released. We're wiping the slate clean. We're starting over.
Yes, ma'am. That's a fact. Hagar?
So,
Odd.
good connection, forgiveness, Jubilee. Forgiveness is built into Jubilee because you're kind of forgiven to and given an opportunity to start over. So it's a systemic forgiving, not a personal forgiving, slightly different. But my main question is, how do you conclude that they never got the opportunity even to practice, or at least once, the Jubilee? If you take the history of Israel,
Because it's not recorded.
it is not recorded, doesn't mean they did not observe or did observe. At least they lasted more than 50 years, right?
Yeah,
The
but
nation of Israel.
they lasted, the kingdom stayed together for 50 years, but they didn't do the sabbatical year, so they got sent to Babylon. So it is possible in the years of silence, which those who don't know, it's the years between Micah and the New Testament, right? It's possible in the years of silence that they did a Jubilee. It's possible. But you'd think there would be a record of it somewhere.
From Joshua
Yeah.
through the judges, through the kings, I believe it's more than 50 years.
Yeah, but they didn't do a Jubilee. They fell away.
Okay,
Right, so that's why you do the 490 years of captivity. You go
That's
to
true.
Look at the timeline.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's more of land Sabbaths, a violation, but they have the opportunity.
No, if they want a scripture, I want to be able to put it up. Yeah.
So they had opportunity to do Jubilee if they want to. So there are multiple 50 years that they went through in the history of Israel.
Yeah, that they existed 50 years, but if they
We don't
didn't
know.
keep the sabbatical year, if they didn't keep the sabbatical year, they probably didn't get to the 50, right? But I mean,
But they are expected, right? They are expected to do Jubilee by God because they signed the covenant at Sinai.
Yeah.
So
They agreed to the terms and conditions. They certainly did.
yeah,
But they didn't make it. Yeah. But if you find it, I mean, you seem to be inspired, right? If you find it,
Well, we better get out and vote for the Democrats. They want to forgive, all our debts, don't they? I mean, isn't that, for these people that went to school? What is it, student loan they call it?
yeah,
Isn't that sort of what you were talking about here?
that, I understand that is a need, right? And they do want to do that, but they don't want to do it for the right reasons, right? Right? Um, yeah, but it's very unfair because of people who have paid off their student loans or even paid into it for a couple of years, right? And then you forgive it. But at the same time, if you think about the 7 years and you think about the 50 years, they would sell a piece of land and it had to be valued based upon this hard set forgiveness date. So at some point, we're going to need to have a forgiveness, right? They're just starting there for nefarious reasons. So,
Phil.
So I have a question, and then I have a set of scriptures I'd like for you to read. And the question is, it deals with Samuel and when they said, "Give us a king,"
yeah.
and they had the king's tribute then. And the king's tribute was then placed upon the burden of the nation that wasn't supposed to be there. That wasn't part of the economical pattern Yahweh put together in the Torah. There is no king in the Torah except for him.
Yeah.
So now let's spin back down to Nehemiah 5. If somebody could read what happens in Nehemiah 5, it's quite interesting because this is when they come right back out of captivity.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens?
You just want the whole chapter?
Yeah, it starts with Nehemiah has to step in.
There was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers, for there were those who said, "We, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live." There were others who said, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our houses, that we might get grain because of the famine." Also, there were those who said, "We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, our children like their children. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters are forced into bondage already, and we are helpless because our fields and vineyards belong to others." Then I was very angry, and I heard their outcry in these words. I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and the rulers and said to them, "You are exacting usury, each from his brother." Therefore I held a great assembly against them. I said to them, "We, according to our ability, have redeemed our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations, and now you would even sell your brothers that they might be sold to us?" Then they were silent, and could not find a word to say. Again I said, "The thing which you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations our enemies? And likewise, I, my brothers, and my servants are lending them money and grain. Please, let us leave off this usury. Please give back to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, also the 100th part of the money and of the grain and the new wine and the oil that you were exacting from them." Then they said, "We will give it back, and we will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say." So I called the priests and took an oath from them, and they would do according to this promise. I also shook out the front of my garment and said, "Thus may God shake out every man from his house and from his possessions who does not fulfill this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied." And all the assembly said, "Amen." And they prayed to Yahweh, and they praised Yahweh. Then the people did according to his promise. There you go. So, Phil.
There's a breaking point there. They came right out of captivity. They put right back into king's tribute. They went right back into debt. They went back into their old system again, breaking the land Sabbaths, breaking the ownership of their vineyards and their fields, breaking their control over their own destinies, and they got eaten alive.
Yeah.
And then he had Nehemiah basically had to call him to task and said, basically, if you don't want to go back into captivity, you got to quit doing this stuff.
Back. Good.
And they made a great promise here. So my question here is, now they all promised to do it the right way. Shouldn't there be a Jubilee? Shouldn't there be a land Sabbath? Shouldn't there be progression after Nehemiah to govern this? Because they just read the law again. They all said amen, stand up and say yes, yes, yes. And now they're saying yes again. And they made the priests take a solemn vow. And the priests had to blow the trumpets. The priests had to declare the year of Jubilee. So why should we find the year of Jubilee following this?
I don't know. It doesn't look like it lasted. We should find it, but it doesn't look like they did it. Now, if there's a record of it, I can't find it. And I searched high and low. The first time this is a rerun. I mean, I searched high and low because I thought, wouldn't that be neat? I wanted to learn from it. I wanted to find that they had actually done it. What would it look like to return to your lands? What the right of redemption, and what would that actually look like? And I just couldn't find it. So I think Ken's next online, right?
No, Tom is next, then
Okay.
Ken.
I've got the mic in possession is actually 9/10 of the law. So, if you, yes, you do, sir. If you look at the land Sabbaths every 7 years, I know some people that will actually break their land into 7 parts, and they will rest it in sequence.
Yeah.
And therefore they have 6/7 of their production every year instead of just shutting the whole thing down. And for some reasons, You need to do that like for, if you're raising garlic, for instance. You need to plant those garlic plants every year or you don't get your seed for the next year. So is there any, I'd just open the floor to it. What do you think about that idea that you rest that portion? Because the land is resting every seventh year in that portion of it.
Well, the people I know who keep the sabbatical year have gone to great lengths to figure out which year it is, because you know how we always want to get it right. And they shut the whole, they actually do take the whole break. Breaking it into sevenths, if I don't think that would fulfill the commandment, because it's not just about agriculture, it's about the whole release, right? It's about the whole thing. But we are stuck in this world, so at least it's a try. You know what I mean? But if you were doing it for the idea of the restoring of the nutrients to the land, that could be something too. But I wouldn't think that breaking it into sevens would not fulfill the intent of the law. Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Ken, online.
There is a way that seemeth right unto man. This is emotional to me. But the ends thereof are the ways of death. And that's why it won't work. Now, when he mentioned breaking it up into sevenths, that's the first thing that come to my mind. I have never heard a message that has been so profound in my thinking as what you just delivered, Chris. I can't go into it, but because it's just very emotional to me to think how we have disobeyed Yahweh for more than decades, for centuries, and I've never understood all of this like you've made this
Well, praise
presentation.
Yahweh, not me. I mean, come on, man.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Yahweh, and I was
Yeah.
doing that. But it's to me, it's very emotional. I think it's earth shaking, and it ought to
Oh.
be. It ought to be shaking us as people of God right to the core. And
Well-
thank Yahweh, and praise Yahweh, and thank you for being faithful to Him, Chris.
All right,
That's
thanks
all
for
I
the
have.
praise, and I just hope these messages spur people to study the Bible, and learn.
It's me. Yes.
All right.
Am I back? Okay. Yeah, real quick. John and Alicia and I probably can relate to this whole thing as far as that. Man, over the years, hundreds and I want to say 1,000 years, but at least hundreds of years, at least in this country, and it transferred everywhere else, as far as agricultural usage, to get around that land Sabbath, they started raising crops that were beneficial to the others. So crop rotation is what they call it. And maybe, I don't know if everybody, there's quite a few people here who understand that. So soybeans or legumes or something are beneficial to restoring nitrogen in the soil, which corn and other grains like that will benefit from it, and vice versa. So that way they can make more money because they're rotating, they're letting it, so to speak, rest, but it's being restored every other year.
The system, they
Right.
have to buy this incredibly expensive corn, and if they don't keep the cycle going, right, if they miss a year, right, then they're going to go bankrupt, and then the bigger crop people are going to go buy up the land. You know what I mean? So
Sure. And kind of even going that, if you want to get back into the more of the evilness of these guys, is they have the GMO corn, GMO soybeans. It's very hard to find anything that's now naturally organic and or just natural, self-producing. They have cutoff switches in these grains so that if you have 6 or 8 or 10 bags of seed corn left over from the previous season, it is now sterile. You cannot propagate from that. So, and they won't give you refunds because it's dead corn, but you paid for it. So there's also, I'm just saying that's even more forcing them to continue every year. They're stuck in that cycle to do that, but yeah, so. Okay,
No, Herman was hand before he popped up.
No.
Ken was there. He was behind me. So we'll get Ken real quick and then Herb will get you both in a second.
Yeah, just one more time. There's a way which seems right unto the man, and that's to where we've been disobedient. I never realized how important Yahweh's law is. He's been gradually shown, but in one fell swoop, I see it more clearly than I ever have, and I hope to see it even yet more clearly. I don't think it's possible for me to see it clearly in one fell swoop, but I've come real close. And again, this is very emotional to me because, um, you know, I don't know how to explain it, but we got to wake up. That's all.
Okay. All right. So when I talk about how it doesn't, Herb's next. When I talk about how it's not in history, this would have been a really big deal, right? If 3 or 4 million people, because I skipped in my notes. My family, my last name Deweese, scattered all over the country. We don't even know where half of each other are, right? So this is way more than crops. It's a whole societal familial thing because the family unit was supposed to stay together, and the family was supposed to stay. So he knew that everybody's going to get scattered. So if this happened in history, that Israel actually did go back to their ancestral homes and the deeds and the titles and all this stuff happened, there would be a huge record of that, right? Because Jeremiah he wrote a deed, right, when they were going into captivity and said that, it was kind of a symbol for when they came back. You would think there'd be a record. I'm sure, because they did burn up the library at Alexandria. I mean, people have been trying to stamp out the history of the Jews, right? Right. So, I mean, they could have erased it, but it just seems like there would be a little hoopla. All right, go ahead.
The various laws of the laws of Moses have certain categories. They fit into certain categories. And the category that has to do with the land Sabbath, the Jubilee year, and so forth, that requires a national effort where there's a unity of the entire country involved. When a person today wants to carry out the land Sabbath laws according to the law of Moses, then that person is putting themselves at an economic disadvantage in terms of all of the other people who are also growing crops and wanting to sell it. And so the question is, how does a person survive in a society in which you're essentially the only one who is trying to do that according to the law of Moses, and everyone else is doing it their normal way? The difficulty of competing under such a disadvantage is a considerable thing that one has to consider. And I'm not trying to circumvent the law of Moses. I'm simply saying that it requires a national effort where a whole country is involved in doing it. So there's a level playing field of all of the people involved. So you cannot take something that requires a national effort to have a uniformity, as would be the case if you had a theocracy. In other words, if the government is ruled by Yahweh, then that government being ruled by Yahweh, you can do everything properly then. But if you're trying to compete with other people that are not under that constraint, you're putting yourself at a severe disadvantage. That problem was actually faced by certain farmers in the Worldwide Church of God days of the 1950s and 60s. And they had a ruling come down from the Worldwide Church of God having to do with this, the aspect of putting yourself at a disadvantage and competing with other people who are trying to sell the same type of a product. So one has to consider that the land Sabbath, the Jubilee year, in order to physically carry it out today, you'd have to have a government that is in harmony with that idea.
So on today's message, and when this comes up, it almost always goes into, seeds and crops, right? Today's message was about the forgiveness of sins, right? It was about the forgiveness of sins. And we used the Jubilee and the sabbatical year to illustrate how you forgive sins and how you forgive your brother and how you forgive debts. You're absolutely right. We cannot declare ourselves sovereign and say we're going to have a release of debts. We're going to have a Jubilee. Nobody will listen to us, right? So we can, but we can't, if you had crops for feeding yourself, right? Then obviously you could do that. When we planted fruit trees in our backyard, we didn't eat the fruit from the tree for the 3 years. There's nothing prohibiting me. There's no reason for me to break that law, right? So, right, because I know the Torah and I know what it says when you get a fruit tree that you got to wait so many years to do it. So you could do it for your own, but you're right. To compete in a marketplace, this would be a very challenging thing, and we ourselves couldn't, strive for people to have a Jubilee or release of debts. But what we can do is be forgiving to our friends and our family and to give generously with one hand not knowing what the other hand does, which not a problem for this group. That's why very generous, incredibly generous people here, right? But we also go home and we're merciful to our family who aren't as much in our faith in order to show them that blessings that God has given us to help bless them, to say, hey, look, don't you want to be like us? Don't you want to have the peace that we have? The other part of this message is in the society, as you're talking, a national effort, this creates a very peaceful culture where you know what to expect. You don't go to market hoping to get a certain amount of money for your crops. You know how much your crops are going to be. You know how much your land is worth because your land is worth what it can produce in Jubilee minus whatever year it is. There's no haggling. So there's a lot of positives to this, but I spent a lot of time on the Jubilee, and the release of debts, but I was hoping to focus it more on the forgiveness side, the 70 times 7 and all that. Okay.